Hello, everyone, and welcome to Loop and Learn's T1D educational series. This is a new series we've been working on because the best way to know how to run your closed loop systems is to understand it and learn all the parts of it. And we figured we'll learn together. It's DIY. Don't do it by yourself, but also do it with others helping. Today we have Gary Scheiner from Integrated Diabetes Services. He spoke last time about hypoglycemia and glucagon, and today he's going to talk all about basal insulin. This is the basis of what you need to know to run your life with diabetes, and this is an important topic, and we're thrilled that we have this series going. So, as always, the disclaimer, the Loop app, if you are doing DIY Loop. Okay, Loop app is a do-it-yourself closed loop algorithm. If you are using any other hybrid closed loop system, you're welcome here. I'm just saying this for those on the DIY Loop. This presentation is provided to share tools available to you in the DIY community and assist you in making your own decisions in consultation with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management. You take full responsibility for building and running the system, and you do so at your own risk. So Gary Scheiner is back with us. He is one of our favorite guests who come teach us stuff. And he's discussing the very essential topic of basal insulin. That's what runs in your system, in your body, all the time. Gary's company, Integrated Diabetes Services, has a full staff of CDCESs who live with T1D, and most of them are using DIY closed loop. And as Carrie says, whether or not you use an automated insulin delivery system, a hybrid closed loop, or even shots, basal insulin is the foundation of management of type 1 diabetes. It's important. So we're a little lucky to hear this today. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn this over to Gary. And thank you so much for being here tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Joanne. Nothing I'd rather be doing at 8 o'clock here on the East Coast than joining the Loopers group. And you're my peeps. I mean, I've been looping now for over 4 years. So it's nice to get together with others who enjoy quality technology. I know a lot of you are muted, but I'm trying to get a sense of how many people on the call are using Loop currently versus how many are using just a different system, or is anybody in here on injection therapy? Anyone at all? I hear crickets.
You can unmute if you are on shots and just say me, and we'll hear you.
There's an MDI. Oh, there's another MDI. Okay. So we got a couple of people on injections. And I assume there's a few people also that are on just standard pump therapy or a system other than Loop, but the majority are Loop users. And that's wonderful. Basal insulin to me is like bolus insulin's little brother. It just doesn't get a lot of attention or respect. Sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of insulins is basal insulin. It has profound effects on our ability to manage our diabetes effectively. Okay, so we're going to discuss the role of basal insulin and the whole fine-tuning process today. Hopefully this will benefit many of you. Let me do a share screen. So we're going to talk about a little bit about basics surrounding basal insulin, the different options for delivering basal insulin. We'll spend most of our time on fine-tuning and then share some of the weird little idiosyncrasies about basal insulin. So basal insulin, I'm sure you all know, this is the continuous gradual flow of insulin going into the body. The purpose of basal insulin, and this is important to remember, is it's just designed to match the amount of glucose that the body is producing on its own. It has nothing to do with food. This is purely to offset how much sugar the liver is producing on our behalf on a regular 24-hour cycle. Basal insulin will allow enough glucose to get into the body's cells to meet our basic metabolic needs. And so it's important for prevention of things like ketosis and severe hyperglycemia. But it's important to recognize that basal insulin levels do vary by time of day. They're not constant the way a lot of people think they are. What really affects the liver's output of glucose is a whole slew of hormones. There's only one hormone in the body that lowers glucose levels. That's insulin. Every other hormone that we produce has the effect of raising glucose levels in some way. Some of the primary ones are cortisol and growth hormone. Those are produced naturally around the clock. We produce more of them at certain hours of the day and less at other hours. But the stress hormones can also affect glucose levels and affect the liver's output of glucose. So ultimately, those are the things that influence how much sugar the liver is producing. So this is a paper that we published years back, just looking at what basal insulin needs look like in different age categories. If you look at the solid lines, the red and the blue, those are the adult patterns. The red line, I'm sorry, those are the juvenile patterns. The red line represents teenagers and the blue line represents younger children. The pattern is the same, but the magnitudes are different. Naturally, teenagers need more insulin than young kids. But you'll notice that during those early growth years, a person's basal needs start to go up in the evening and stay high all night long. That's a very common pattern we see in kids. The dashed lines represent what we see in adults. The green line is what we see in middle-aged adults, and the pink line is what we see in older adults. And those patterns mimic each other very closely also. The older adults require a little bit less basal insulin because their hormone production is a little bit lower. But the pattern that you see is that peak in the early morning hours. And anybody know what that peak in basal insulin requirement is called?
Dawn phenomenon.
Very good, the dawn phenomenon. That's right. I thought it'd be a good name for a band if we ever form a all diabetic band, call it dawn phenomenon. But yeah, that peak in the early morning hours is caused by cortisol and growth hormone production in adults that takes place right before we wake up in the morning. Kids are producing growth hormone straight through the night from the time they go to bed, and that's why their basal needs go up in the evening and stay high all night long. It's important to have the basal settings correct. If we're not receiving the proper doses of basal insulin, glucose levels are always going to be rising and falling. Now, even when they're set properly, there's a little bit of movement. I'm talking about more significant rises and falls in the glucose. Overnight, blood sugars don't hold steady when the basal insulin level is not correct. And we don't have much in the way of schedule flexibility. If meals are delayed and boluses are delayed, glucose levels have a way of getting out of control if the basal rates are not set properly. Now, with correct basal settings, glucose levels tend to hold steady between meals and while we sleep. And that allows all the schedule flexibility we want. We can determine when we eat, how often we eat, when we sleep, when we exercise, etc. It allows a lot more flexibility in our schedules. It also allows us to make effective short-term adjustments. And we call these either temp basal rates, or in the case of loop, we call them temp overrides. But it allows for more effective temp overrides if the standard basal rates are set properly. And for anybody using an automated insulin delivery system, having the correct basal settings as the foundation allows the system to perform much better. If the basal rates are not set properly, then the automated system is going to be chasing rising and falling glucose almost all the time instead of maintaining it within a healthy range. So what are our options for delivering basal insulin? First, consider what typical basal insulin needs look like. In most adults, again, we have a bit of a peak to the basal insulin in the early morning hours. And most adults require a lot less basal insulin in the middle of the day. And then, gradually comes up again. So we're trying to mimic that type of a program with different options. Now, I don't think anyone's using NPH these days, But we do have a lot of people using long-acting insulins like Glargine, Detamir, and Degludec. And then we have insulin pump therapy that lets us, match the insulin more carefully to the body's needs. The issue we run into using a long-acting basal insulin, and that's represented by the pink line, is that there tends to be too little basal insulin overnight and in the early morning. So glucoses have a tendency to rise. And then in the middle of the day, there tends to be too much basal insulin. So the glucose drops in the middle of the day. So on the other issue we have, especially with Detamir, is it doesn't always last the full 24 hours. So what some people do is they raise the dose to cover their nighttime needs. They figure, well, at least I'm steady overnight. So when you have that high dose of basal insulin, now you're getting way too much during the day. If you're not eating at regular intervals, you wind up hypoglycemic. And God forbid you try to exercise when that basal insulin is at a high level like that. And the blood sugars can drop very, very fast. So we wind up with issues of hypoglycemia during the daytime when we do this. So what if we go the other direction and lower the basal to meet the daytime needs? Now we've got the problem with the overnight blood sugars rising. Middle of the night, during the dawn phenomenon, glucoses are going up and we have high fasting readings. You're stable during the day, but high at night. So that's why pump therapy is optimal. We can customize the basal insulin delivery around every individual's specific needs. But it's important to recognize that the basal rates have to be set correctly for this to function as it's intended. And that's not always the case. But pump therapy allows us to deliver insulin in very precise increments. Diurnal regulation has to do with the 24-hour cycle of basal insulin. So as we produce the cortisol and the growth hormone in the middle of the night and the early morning hours, the basal is pre-programmed to go up during those times to offset it and to match it. And then during the day, we tend to have lower settings to match those needs. Pumps allow us to set temporary adjustments, and we'll go over some options and situations where those are useful in just a little bit. We can suspend delivery when we need to, and with the new systems, we have automated adjustment available to us. You can't just change the basal delivery when you take long-acting insulin. When you inject that stuff, you're stuck for the next 24 to 30 hours with that same dose. You can't just concentrate and do a Vulcan mind meld with your insulin and have it work better or worse. It's always going to be constant. So how do we go about fine-tuning our basal insulin? First, consider how much basal insulin is really required. In most people, most active, fairly fit individuals, basal insulin tends to represent around 40% of the total for the day. And again, this is also for people who are eating a modest or reasonable amount of carbohydrate. People who are on very low carbohydrate diets and people who are very inactive, the proportion of basal insulin tends to get higher. It might be 50%, it might even be more than that. But for the majority of people with type 1 diabetes, basal insulin usually gravitates to around 40%, give or take. As I mentioned earlier, as we get older, our basal insulin needs go down. The bolus needs don't, but the basal tends to go down. So the basal percentage gets a little bit lower as we get older. And for anybody who's converting back and forth between a pump and injections, we usually have to make a 20% adjustment to the dose. So if you're getting, let's say, 10 units a day of insulin from your basal from your pump, to go on injections, you would take 12 units and vice versa. If anyone is taking injected basal insulin, we do try to fine-tune the dose to try to keep things stable overnight. As long as you're able to eat at regular intervals during the day, that's really the best option we've got for maintaining tight glucose control. And we can test the dose by seeing what happens to the glucose overnight. So if you eat dinner and then don't eat or take any bolus insulin after dinner, we can start evaluating the glucose about 4 hours post-dinner. So let's say you have dinner at 6, you would observe what your blood sugar does from 10 o'clock at night until morning. If it stays within 30 points through the night, that's fine. That's good enough. Or if you're measuring millimoles, if it stays within 2 points through the night, that's fine. But if it rises or falls by more than 30 points or 2 millimole, then we would adjust that basal insulin dose by about 10% and try it again to see what happens. But even those on injections have to consider adjusting that dose based on heavy days of physical activity or heavy days of alcohol consumption. But what about those of us who are on pumps, including all of the loopers out there? So should we assume there's going to be a peak when we set up our initial basal rate? I don't do that. When I start someone on pump therapy, we do start with a flat basal profile and then adjust from there. And the main reason we do that is you can never really predict exactly what someone's needs are going to be. Just because the normal basal peak is in the early morning doesn't mean everyone experiences that. And remember, basal insulin has only one job, and that's to keep the glucose steady when you're under normal copacetic conditions. So when you don't have food digesting, you're not exercising, and there's nothing unusual going on in your body hormonally, the basal insulin should keep the glucose level nice and flat. That means the basal insulin and the liver are in nice equilibrium with each other. It doesn't matter if the glucose is 100 or 200. The basal insulin is designed to keep it where it is, not to get it to any particular number. Bolus insulin is used to get us where we want. Basal insulin is designed to keep it there when we do. So the conditions for testing basal rates, I'll just outline for you here. We don't want food digesting during a basal test because that's obviously going to raise the glucose level. So we try to stop eating about 4 hours before we do a basal test. You can't eat or drink. You can't really have any calories during a basal test. Even protein can cause the glucose to rise. So we don't allow any calories at all when doing a basal test, only things like water and diet beverages. We also try to avoid high-fat meals before testing the basal rates. High-fat food not only digests more slowly, but if there's a lot of fat in the meal, it's going to cause some insulin resistance later on, and that's going to drive the glucose up as well. So a fairly healthy meal about 4 hours before starting a test. The last bolus needs to be given about 4 hours before the test as well. We want the bolus to clear before the basal testing begins. So when you do bolus for your meal, you need to do it as a normal bolus. You can't be extending it real far. And if you're using absorption time on your system, you probably keep it at around 3 hours. Activity levels need to be kept constant during a basal test. You can do normal daily activities, but no heavy exercise. We want the liver producing its normal amounts of glucose during a basal test. So we try not to test after you've had a low blood sugar because the liver overproduces glucose for a while. We don't basal test during illnesses or if you're taking steroid medications. And for women who are having their periods, we don't do basal testing for a few days before or after the period starts. The basal insulin needs to be delivered in an uninterrupted fashion. So you have to stay connected to your pump. You don't want to change the infusion site or the reservoir of insulin while you're testing. You can't suspend the pump. You don't want to use temporary basals. And for those of us using automated systems, we need to turn off the automated feature 3 to 4 hours before the basal test begins. So for example, if you're doing an evening test, you have dinner at say 6 o'clock, right after you bolus for dinner, switch off loop or switch off your automated mode so that it's not making its own adjustments to the basal. You want your pre-programmed basal rates being delivered since that's what you're actually testing. It's best to use CGM to collect the data. Doing finger sticks every hour or two is a real pain in the neck. But try not to do this during your sensor warm-up period because you'd miss data. And likewise, don't do it if your sensor is about to expire because, again, you're going to miss data. And when using a system like Dexcom that can be calibrated, it's best not to calibrate during a basal test. Now, even if the CGM is a bit off, all we want to see is if you're rising or falling. It doesn't matter if it's off by 30 or 40 points. If it shows a steady glucose, that you can count on. If it shows a rise or a fall, that's also dependable. So here's an example of a schedule, and sometimes we break it up into 3 stages or 4. In kids, we sometimes do it in 5 stages, so they don't have to fast quite as long. So if, base the first test on when you normally have dinner. If you have dinner at 6, this schedule would work fine. If you normally have dinner at 8, have dinner at 8 and then start the test at midnight. You would end the test when you have breakfast the next morning. And the morning test would just be a matter of skipping breakfast in the morning. You would skip breakfast, wait until lunchtime, and see how your glucose does. But remember, you got to shut off your loop or your loop feature, your closed loop thing, 3 or 4 hours beforehand. So for the morning test, you may have to turn it off when you go to bed the night before, unless you feel like waking up in the middle of the night and switching loop off. Or if you're like me and you have to go to the bathroom anyway, and switch it off then. The afternoon test is where you eat breakfast and skip lunch. And you just go till dinner time before eating again. And then the evening test, you eat lunch and have a late dinner. So with each of these, you're missing 1 meal, and it gives you a chance to examine the basal during that phase of the day. And you might have seen earlier, I had a few conditions where you would stop your basal test. If you drop below 70 or even 80, a lot of people stop if they drop into the 70s. Stop the test then and eat something. And likewise, if you go really high, if you go above, say, 240, 250, once the basal test begins, you probably should stop it and give a correction dose. But it's fine to run a basal test if you're a little on the high side. That's perfectly fine. You'll get valid results doing that. We adjust the basal if we see a fairly steady rise or fall during the test phase of more than 30 points, like I mentioned before. If the pattern is very irregular, if it goes up and down, I would repeat it. That's not a typical pattern within a 4, 5, 6 hour period. Something else was probably influencing the glucose if you had that kind of irregular pattern. The adjustments are generally made an hour before the glucoses change in children. So for example, if the blood sugar is rising from 7 to 10 a.m., we would raise the basal from 6 to 9. In adults, we tend to make the adjustments 2 hours beforehand. And even with insulins like Fiasp and Lumjev, which work a little faster than traditional rapid insulins, we still make the adjustments 1 to 2 hours ahead of time. The magnitude of the adjustment is another thing to consider. The lower your normal basal rates are, the smaller the incremental change should be. Somebody who's taking 1.5 units of basal an hour, changing the basal by 0.05 or 0.1 is meaningless. You have to make larger adjustments for that. Likewise, those who are on very small doses, who are really sensitive, should be making the adjustments in smaller increments. But again, if you do see a significant rise or fall in the glucose, you can make a somewhat larger change to the basal dose. So here's an example of somebody who was looking at their sensor overlay report and just noticed that overnight, the glucose is rising. They're not eating after 8 o'clock. They're just getting their standard basal rate. So what that means, if the glucose looks like it's rising starting at around 1 a.m. most nights, that's a sign that the basal at midnight needs to come up. Remember, we make the adjustments an hour before the glucose starts its rise or fall. You have to think at least an hour ahead. Here's an adult with type 1 who's on MDI. And what they're finding is that if they don't snack at night, they wind up low in the morning. And you can see what's happening overnight is their glucose is dropping while they sleep. And we try to set the basal insulin to keep things stable overnight when you're on injections. So this is a clear sign that the basal insulin dose is too high. You'd probably knock it down by 10% and repeat. And here's an instance where somebody just happened to do a basal test without even realizing it. They had a late breakfast around 9 o'clock, and they didn't eat again until almost dinner time. And you can see how stable the glucose was in the afternoon. That's a sign that the basal rate is doing its job in the afternoon. So that's a successful test. I mean, it's a successful test no matter what you learn. If you find that you're rising or falling, that's also successful because you learn something that'll help you improve your glucose management. So in this case, the glucose is stable from 1 to 5 p.m. So since it's an adult, we'd say, all right, from 11 to 3, the basal rate is verified and it's set properly.
Gary, do you want questions as you go along? Should I
Tell you
ask
what, let's do
chat?
them. We'll have plenty of time. I'm almost done. We can take questions at the end.
At the end?
Now, again, these are the patterns we tend to see, but in this particular study, there were 322 subjects, data who was incorporated. No two people had the same patterns. The peaks happen at different times. The magnitude of the peaks and valleys happened at different times. That's why the testing is necessary. We can't just assume that if you weigh 170 pounds and you're 46 years old, that this is what you're going to need. It just doesn't work that way. Everybody's basal pattern and basal requirements is unique to them. A few things about a person's basal pattern. If it looks like the graph on the left, something's wrong. If it starts looking like a city skyline with multiple peaks and valleys, that's not the way the body works. The body works in more of a circadian pattern. The basal needs there's usually one time of day where there's a peak, one time of day where there's the lowest level, and gradual changes in between. Few just secret tips that I'll share with you from experience over the years. It's best if you start on a pump, or even if you transition from injections back to a pump, don't evaluate your basals the first 24 hours. There's almost always some residual injected basal insulin working those first 24 hours after you start the pump. I like to wait a minimum of 48 hours from the last injected insulin before looking at a person's basal rates. If you start a basal test with a glucose that's moderately elevated, let's say you're around 200 or higher, it's natural for the blood sugar to drop slightly. That's just because we're spilling sugar in the urine. So if you do a basal test, you start at 200 and wind up at 160, it's probably perfectly fine, because we expect that kind of a gradual drop anyway. And even if you have a mild low, if you go down into the 70 or 80 range, there's a good chance your body's going to kick out some hormones to counteract that. It won't be a significant rise, but it's normal to see a little bit of a bump up if you go into that kind of a range. When you break a fast, all hell is going to bust loose. Don't even try to manage your glucose. I mean, you're going to spike really high. This is a natural phenomenon that when we come off of a fast, the stomach empties extra quickly. And every nutrient, every molecule of glucose is going to get absorbed into the bloodstream. So you're going to see a pretty sharp rise and a higher than usual rise after that meal you have when you break a fast. If you see enormous rises or falls in your glucose during a basal test, it's probably not the basal insulin that caused it. Basal adjustments are usually warranted if there's a modest rise or fall. But if your glucose shoots up 150 points, it's probably something else that caused it. Might have been stress, might have been a bad infusion site, who knows? But huge changes, I would repeat the test and see if it repeats. People who are in their honeymoon phase, who still produce a little of their own insulin, tend to have pretty flat basal profiles. And that's just because the pancreas will compensate. If the pump isn't giving quite enough basal or is giving too much, the pancreas will make its own adjustments to keep the blood sugar in range. Likewise, anybody with type 2 diabetes who still produces any of their own insulin is going to have a flatter basal profile than a type 1. Children naturally have more variability in their glucose, and that's just due to body size. We see the same thing in small adults versus very large adults. The smaller adults' glucoses tend to vary more than the larger adults do. All right, so just a quick rundown now on this feature, the temporary basal rate. And this is analogous to what we can do in Loop with the temp override feature. And if you're using Loop 3 or 3.2, we can also do temp basal rates in here. So keep in mind, basal insulin's job is to keep our glucose steady under normal conditions. But think about it. How often is your life really under normal conditions? There's a lot of things that affect either our sensitivity to insulin or how our liver is functioning. For example, I think I mentioned before the effect high-fat food can have. High-fat meals can cause a state of temporary insulin resistance. It's kind of like having type 2 diabetes for a while. So what we usually recommend with really high-fat meals is to bump the basal up by about 50% for the next 8 hours or so, at least until your triglyceride levels in your bloodstream settle back to normal. And then the insulin sensitivity returns to normal along with that. This is why if you go out to dinner or you get have a high-fat dinner, your glucose at bedtime might look great, but the next morning it's much higher than you want it to be. Or you might find that Loop struggles to keep your blood sugar under 150 or 180 through the night, even though it's jacking up the basal or doing auto boluses through the night. During illness, we also become very insulin resistant. Any form of infection is going to do that. So if you find that your glucose is running higher than usual and you're ill, don't hesitate to bump your basal up by anywhere from 50 to 100% to help the system to work better. With major stress, especially if it's a predictable form of stress, you can raise your basal by about 80% for a few hours. If you do it ahead of time, it'll work well. We can't really raise the basal when stress happens. It's too late. But if you know you're going to be speaking in front of an audience at 5 o'clock, you could raise your basal around 3 or 4 to help offset the stress hormones you'll be making soon. With long periods of inactivity, most people find their glucose creeps up steadily. Loop may be able to handle this for you, but if you find you're rising during long periods of sitting, help it out. Raise your delivery by 30 or 40%. With menstrual cycles, many women require extra basal insulin for a few days leading up to their period, and some require a little bit of a basal reduction the day that their period begins. With long periods of physical activity, it's very helpful to lower the delivery. And we can do presets in Loop. I have presets for different types of activities. And I've got, for a short bout, for a longer bout, and more intense. You can get creative with this. But certainly with long bouts of activity, it's beneficial to cut the basal back by at least 50%. This is another one that has to be set an hour or two ahead of time to be effective. If you wait until you're going to go outside and get your exercise, it's too late. The basal you got up till that point is going to be predominant for the next few hours. Delayed onset lows are another thing many people experience after intense bouts of exercise. Loop does a pretty nice job of offsetting this because it tends to be a very gradual, slow decline. But if you still notice that you're dropping overnight after really active days, cut your delivery back by 20 or 30%. If you're nauseous and your glucose is dropping, this is a time when you can cut your basal back dramatically for a few hours. I wouldn't shut it off completely, but reduce it significantly so that your glucose doesn't wind up low. Because if you're not able to take carbohydrates orally, this can become pretty dangerous. And with alcohol consumption, alcohol suppresses the liver's production of glucose. So the blood sugars will have a tendency to drop after we drink. So cutting the basal back by about 40% after drinking is a sensible thing to do. The average person takes about 2 hours to metabolize a drink. So if you have 4 beers, cut your basal for the next 8 hours. So my mantra, think like a pancreas. The basis of this is still the basal insulin. And whether you're on injections, standard pump therapy, hybrid closed loop system, or the best system in the world, which is loop, we still have to think like a pancreas and make sure our basal delivery is correct. So that's what I got. So I guess we have some time for questions if anybody has any.
Both Ellen and Tina are going to be pitching you questions. So, and then I'll just come back in the end. But Tina is an admin with Loop and Learn. Ellen is one of our editors and one of our cherished volunteers. We're always looking for volunteers, by the way. But go ahead, Ellen.
One of the questions is, how often should you test basal? And if you lose or gain weight, do you test again all times of the day or certain times?
Yeah, that's a great question. As adults, we can usually just do it once. And once we get it, we know what our pattern is. We know where our peak is, where our valley is, how big a difference there is between those. And then, if there's a major change in lifestyle, if you gain a lot of weight, lose a lot of weight, if your activity level changes dramatically, usually everything can just be shifted up or down based on what you're seeing. So if you happen to lose a significant amount of weight and you find either that you're having frequent lows, or when you look at your loop data and find the system's cutting your basal back constantly, you might need to lower your basal settings uniformly across the board.
What do you think about testing and then comparing the kind of testing that you suggested to autotune?
I find autotune often comes up short. I mean, it misses things that may have been taking place during a true basal test. Again, there are so many things that can affect glucose levels. And just looking at autotune in times where it's raising and lowering delivery, or times when a bolus wasn't given for a while, there may have been exercise taking place. There may have been stress. There may have been medications affecting it. Moods and emotions can be affecting it. This is why I don't believe in any automated system that can analyze data for someone with diabetes. It takes a human eye to look at this stuff. Because we're not machines. There's a lot going on in our lives all the time. So I'm not a big fan of autotune. I think it is better to go through this battery of tests and as a human being able to evaluate what's going on.
You looked at the CGM overlay report to help determine if basal needed adjustment. Do you think that Night Scout, how would you compare the data in Night Scout? Is that more helpful? Are there things you would look at there as well?
Well, Night Scout does give us a nice weekly report, which is an overlay. But if you're doing an individual basal test, you don't even need to do that. You just look at the data when you did the test. You can look right at your Dexcom display for that sort of thing, or your Libre if you're using that, or your Medtronic if you're using that. Hopefully you're not. But typically when you're actually doing a basal test, you look at your sensor tracing right then and there for that individual day. If you want to go back and look at what the patterns are like, that's where looking at an overlay graph can be beneficial, especially if you're eating your meals at pretty consistent times. You can get a sense of what's going on in the situations when you're not usually eating.
Okay, great. Brad, I'm not sure I completely understand your question. So if I totally botch this, will you jump in, please?
No, that's okay. I think I got it. It really relates to the peak insulin. Because Gary, you had suggested making an adjustment 1 or 2 hours before the rise. I guess my question really goes to the various insulins and the peak levels.
That's a fair question. When it comes to Humalog, Novolog, and Apidra, their action profiles are indistinguishable. There's no difference between those. I mean, there may be individuals who find somewhat of a difference, but when we look at populations, and there's really no difference. With Fiasp and Lyumjev, you can basically take all of the other insulins and just shift them by about 5 to 8 minutes. That's really the only difference we see. The onset and the peak are 5 to 8 minutes earlier. So it's not going to dramatically change with the ultra rapid insulins. If somebody's using U500 regular in a pump, it's a whole different story. But I don't think hopefully nobody here is having to do that. And if anybody is using U200 Humalog, it acts like ordinary U100 Humalog.
Okay, here's a question. Quite a few loopers are using a single basal rate and then adjusting ISF to deal with dawn phenomena and changes during the day. What are your views on that approach as opposed to multiple basal rates?
Well, I guess there's more than one way to solve this. I find that with the patients that I work with, it's better to have the right basal settings, because if you're relying on correcting highs and correcting lows, now you're fixing things instead of preventing the problems. If the basal is correct, things should hold steady. If you're relying on fixing things, you're waiting until the glucose starts going up or down before fixing them. So that's why I think having the correct basal settings makes these automated systems work in the best way possible. And I had a patient this morning She started on the Omnipod 5 recently. We got a lot of issues with the 5 because it produces a flat, called an adjusted basal profile. Before she went on it, she had a pretty significant peak in her basal starting at 5 a.m. She went from like a 0.4 to a 0.8 right at 5 a.m. And since she's been on Omnipod 5, every morning we see her glucose climb from 6 to 9 a.m. by almost 100 points. So now she gets up early. She's got to give herself a bolus before that rise starts, because the Omnipod 5 is using a flat profile instead of the right basal rates to prevent those kind of rises. But it can work the other way too. The glucose can fall at times. Let's say at noon, your basal needs go down dramatically. If you have a flat basal profile, it's going to start heading down before Loop or any automated system is going to do anything about it. So you got to deal with that drop every single day, as opposed to preventing the rise or the fall by having the basal correct to begin with.
Do you find that there are different basal rates for the weekend versus the weekdays?
The weekend weekday difference is often related to some lifestyle changes. Sleep patterns may change. I mean, there's nothing about Saturday and Sunday where human beings just are different. It's like going across state lines. You can't practice in New York, but you can practice in New Jersey. It's ridiculous. But there's nothing about the weekends per se. But if somebody is eating more high-fat foods on the weekends, or getting more exercise, or sleeping more, or whatever, or drinking more, that's what's causing the changes in the glucose levels. And those are things where we can apply our tempo overrides in those kind of situations.
Oh, so you leave the basal steady and deal with the 4 or 6 or 8 hours.
Yeah, if somebody's basal needs peak at, let's say, 5 a.m., they're going to peak at 5 a.m. on weekends or weekdays. It doesn't matter. It's all the other stuff that might require changes.
Got it. Thank you.
How often should basal testing be done?
I like to do it once the right way. As I mentioned before, if you do one good set of basal tests, you'll have a pretty good understanding of what your 24-hour pattern should look like. It doesn't mean those settings are going to hold that way forever. But usually when adjustments need to be made, we don't have to go through a whole series of tests. We just shift everything up or shift everything down, depending on the situation. So it's not like, you lose weight and your basal needs at night change, but during the day they don't. No, it all changes. So it's a fairly easy adjustment once you have that initial set of basal rates determined.
So how do you stagger those tests? Like, especially I think for an adult who is self-disciplined, it might be somewhat easier than for a kid. How would you suggest doing that for an adult or for a kid?
In basal testing, it's never easy. I'm not going to pretend that it is. It takes effort. And oftentimes you have to go through a test a few times to get it right. And so if you do an overnight test, you might go low the first time, you have to repeat it. Then you go high the next time, you got to repeat it. Or you have to make a change and repeat it to see if the change is working. So it's a process, but it's a very worthwhile process. This is, like we said, it's the foundation. And if you don't pay attention to if you skip steps on your foundation, bad things can happen. So it is important to go through. My recommendation to simplify it is just start with the overnight basal test. Do your dinner, don't have a snack, and get the overnight one done. Once the overnight one's done, then think about doing the morning. And do that morning test and skip breakfast. And once that's done, then think about doing the afternoon. Don't think about all these different tests you have to do. Think about one at a time. I think that's an easier pill to swallow.
Is it possible to do a 24-hour test to complete it in one session?
It's possible, but I don't recommend it. Once you get past about 12 hours of fasting, the liver's output of glucose changes a bit. So it's best to do them in smaller segments. It mimics better what would happen if you had to skip a meal, which is more real life. Of course, every fall on Yom Kippur, it's a day of atonement, but it's also the day of basal testing. It's a great way to see if the settings are right.
That's a very good way to look at it.
I figure I'm written into the book of life if I survive the day and my blood sugars look good. But I'll tell you, every time I break that fast, man, do I go high. Doesn't matter if I bolus more than I think I need for what I eat. I break that 24-hour fast, I will wind up in the 300s no matter what I do.
Wow.
What if you did some exercise an hour or two before breaking the fast? Would that help you?
It would, but I just fasted for 24 hours. I'm not in any mood to exercise.
All right.
So you're like face down on the floor drinking some juice, right?
That's right. I'm there. I'm half dead, but my blood sugar is better after I eat. So only so much I will do to manage my blood sugar that well.
We have a question about, can a bad night's sleep cause cortisol spikes or change insulin sensitivity?
Oh, sure.
And
Yeah.
Should I use a temporary basal rate or override?
I think you have to learn from experience. For some people, interrupted sleep or skipping sleep or extra long periods of sleep can have sometimes unpredictable effects on the glucose levels. So you base it on experience. Like anything with diabetes, it's trial and adjustment. If you find that when you sleep in, your blood sugar starts rising in the morning, yeah, maybe you can make an adjustment if you're planning to sleep late. If you know that after a bad night's sleep, you tend to run higher most of the day, and that happens to a lot of people, yeah, maybe you can kick your delivery up by 20 or 30% the next day. But base it on experience. I don't make assumptions about things like that.
It's an interesting question. Someone who's switching from tandem to control IQ. Should she start with a flat basal rate? As you suggested, she has a detailed profile that she worked out with her doctor, but she's seeing a lot of difference now on looping.
Well, if you had a basal program on Tandem that seemed to work reasonably, use that as the starting point in Loop. The Medtronic and Insulet systems are the ones that don't let you use your preferred basal programs. Tandem does, and all the DIY systems do. So I give them credit. I give DIY and Tandem credit for recognizing the importance of being able to use the basal rates you prefer.
Okay, so Emmanuel was asking, what about more advanced algorithms that adjust the basal rate based on CGM readings automatically? Is that reliable since it is using your profile basal to adjust to a different circumstance?
Well, they're not really learning about your patterns and specific needs. What Medtronic and Insulet do is they take a period of 5, 6, 7 days and average your daily insulin use. And they figure, well, half of that's going to be basal. So that's going to be our starting point. So let's say you're averaging 30 units a day. They're going to figure 15 of that has to be basal, even though it doesn't. And they divide that by 24 and come up with 0.6 or whatever it is, and use that as the flat basal that it starts with. So if you go through, let's say, a week where you're sick and your insulin needs go up a lot, you're going to get too much basal insulin after you're over that illness because it's raised your background delivery rate. So it's going to be fixing falling blood sugars for a period of time. And the same thing if you have to take a steroid medication, you're going to have much higher needs for a while. Or if you're at a sports camp and your needs are lower than usual, that's going to continue for a period of time after the activity ends. So again, they're not really learning anything other than how much insulin you use overall and establishing the flat basal pattern based on that.
We have a question from someone who's experiencing highs, 100 or 200 points after low carb meals, and wondering what strategies should be tried.
Either have more carbs or bolus for the protein. In very low carb meals, the liver is going to convert some of the protein that's digested into glucose. So if you have more carbs, you're less likely to see that happen. Or if you want to stick with low carb meals, start counting your protein grams and bolus for about 50% of that.
Another question is, do hormones only affect the liver's glucose output, or do they affect insulin sensitivity as well?
Come on, hormones affect everything and anything. We got a wedding coming up in October. My daughter has turned into bridezilla. I know all about hormones. This has been a challenging time. Yeah, certain hormones cause insulin resistance, stress hormones in particular. So when those stress hormones are produced and for a while afterwards, insulin does not work as well. That's responsible for the rebound we see after hypoglycemia. It's the insulin resistance as well as the increased glucose output from the liver. I do want to mention that if anybody would like some, one-on-one guidance with their Loop system or any system they're using, I got a wonderful team here. 8 of our 10 clinicians use Loop. The other 2 are using Tandem because they have problems wearing Omnipod. So our clinicians all live with type 1 personally, and I think we're pretty good at helping find the cause of some of the problematic issues with the glucose, or just helping people fine tune and learn how to self-manage more effectively. So my email and phone number are there. Please reach out if there's anything we can do to help.
We've heard awesome things about the team there too. I have a tip in case this might help any of them, if it's an adhesive issue or if it might help somebody else here. We use Cavalon, which is a spray. It's like spray plastic that's used a lot under I can't think of the right word, but it's used a lot in the medical community. And we have found that that's all we need to do for adhesive that is too strong for our young person's skin, in terms of like when you pull it off, it wants to pull the skin with it, or for things that cause irritation. So they might try that. And it comes as a spray, and it comes on wipes too. I was just going to say, our educational series is going to continue on the 3rd with our reading group. We're looking at displays right now. And then again, on April 6th, we're going to welcome Jenny Smith from IDS and Carson Wedding from Loop and Learn, who are going to do a panel discussion on menstruation and looping. And it's going to be on, like I said, on April 6th. And both of these events are at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern.
Okay, so back to the reading assignment. You all have reading assignments, which is start to familiarize yourself with Loop Docs. Look at it, poke on buttons, and then go over to the display section and just read through it. And we'll have open mic so you can ask any question on displays or anything. And then you'll see Gary back again in 3 or 4 weeks, and he'll be talking about Night Scout reports, how to analyze, all the good stuff you want to hear. That should be fascinating. And we have an interesting lineup coming to make sure we all understand what we're doing. So this has been.
We'll use Joanne's data as a test sample. So Joanne,
Sure,
you
go
can
for
behave
it.
yourself between now.
Go
and
for it. By the way, you did mention something we both liked a lot, Tina and I, the analogy of a high-fat meal is like having type 2 diabetes for a while. It is, and I've never heard it put that way. So most interesting. Thank you. Really appreciate it. We'll see you again. We'll see Jenny first. And this is great, Gary. We appreciate it.
It's great. Great
Thank
seeing
you
all
so
of you. I
much.
enjoyed this.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.